Hello, everyone. Welcome to Real People, a podcast that highlights some amazing guests who are doing important work to make it possible for people to thrive and be their best, both at work and in the broader realm of living life to its fullest. I'm Harold Hillman, Managing Director of Sigmoid Curve Consulting Group, based in Auckland, New Zealand. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Charlotte Roberts to Real People. She is not just a guest with us today. She is also a dear friend and a lifelong mentor who has shaped my thinking about leadership and life, perhaps more so than any other person I have ever known. Charlotte has been an executive consultant for over 25 years, coaching executives and executive teams and helping companies build leadership programs and that whole realm of building capability in leadership. With Peter Senge and others, Charlotte co-authored two best-selling leadership books, The Fifth Discipline and the Fifth Discipline Field Book, followed by what was The Dance of Change. And my goodness gracious, is that not playing itself out right now? These three books had profound impact on how I think about leadership. Charlotte has published several articles, including her research on executives' experience of dissociation at work. She also co-authored The Mindful Board, Mastering the Art of Conscious Governance with Martha Somerville. Charlotte was part of the leadership team in a consulting firm, Innovation Associates, when I met her. After the sale of that company, Charlotte established her own consulting firm called Blue Fire Partners near Charlotte, North Carolina, a beautiful city in a beautiful state. Charlotte has returned as trustee on the Guilford College Board after 12 years of past service. She is currently serving on the Board of Governors for Antioch University, a national network of graduate degree programs. She has served on several educational and nonprofit boards as a way to pay forward the opportunity she has been given. Charlotte, on your bio, it says, for fun, you love to travel to new places, garden, cook new dishes, and walk at a peaceful place. When I last saw you in person, feels like 5 years ago on a visit to North Carolina, we took a very peaceful walk in the country. And so that made me smile. Welcome, my friend and mentor. I'm delighted we can make this happen today.
Thank you, Harold. It's a delight to be with you and to see you.
What a year! Look, what a year! I mean, we are in June of 2020, in a year that certainly for me will go down as the most memorable in my life. What have you been reflecting on, my dear friend?
Oh, and I've had the time to reflect with the quarantine, as I'm sure you have as well. So what I've been reflecting on is two big things. One is, what is our obligation to other people? That could be me to another individual, another human, or my organization to another organization. So an example, Harold, my obligation to another person would be, should I wear a mask? This is a big issue in the United States. Or should I not? What's my obligation? When it comes to community, what's my obligation to the community or an organization? So that's one, obligations to other people. The second thing I've been thinking about is the system. You and I have done a lot of systems thinking and working with people to see systems. And are we seeing a system, and we give you three options. Are we seeing a system in chaos? Are we seeing a system in crisis? Or are we seeing a system in collapse? And there's some people who would say we're in the sixth stage of collapse.
Which in the sense of a system collapsing in order to resurge in a different way.
Yes, and collapse is worse than obviously crisis. Collapse is it falls apart in many elements and has to be rebuilt. There would be dark times for a period of time. So when I think about chaos, crisis, or collapse, then I'm thinking, well, how long is this going to last? And will we be back in quarantine in the fall? What will be happening to us in the next 2 years, 5 years?
You will
so
have
I'm
been,
with you. this may be the beginning of something you and I have never seen before.
Definitely. You will have been reflecting deeply about leadership over the last 4 months or so. You are a natural systems thinker, so I know you go deep in your thinking around how, in some cases, a company or a country actually needs to rebuild mental models, new mental models, in the case of the states around diversity and inclusion.
Absolutely. There are about 3 different things you said there. One was leadership, one was mental models, and one was diversity and inclusion. Leadership is a part of all that. And I agree with you. One of the things we're seeing is leaders are going to have to lead people in new mental models, new business models. The businesses are changing. The organization's work is changing. People's demands are changing. So how does a leader lead people in rethinking and seeing a model as it's emerging? Because there's no clear one answer right now. So how do you lead people in seeing a new mental model and then implementing that mental model?
Makes perfect sense. And when I met you back in 1993 at Amoco Corporation, the thing that really captivated me was, particularly in terms of the 5th discipline, and then later the dance of change, was that organizations needed to become more nimble and agile in terms of understanding and mastering the dance of change. That feels like a long time ago. And here we are in 2020, in a year which absolutely is reinforcing the agility required to live and lead in this world.
Yes. And so are there organizations that are learning right now? And look how much they have to learn. So I think a role of leaders is to make sure that the organization is learning. We used to say, Harold, learning faster than their competitors. I would say, can you lead your industry? Can you lead your competitors along? Can all of us learn a little faster about what we need to do and how we can adapt so that we don't get all the way to collapse? And if we do get to serious crisis or collapse, then what does resilience look like for us, whether that's my community or my organization, my state, my country?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So lifting back up to a bit of a global level, I'm sitting here in New Zealand. You're sitting there in North Carolina in the U.S. right now, at a time that perhaps has not been as tumultuous since the 1960s and the race riots that were occurring following the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. What are you thinking about leadership in the U.S. right now? We're looking at it from afar, and it doesn't look pretty. How's it look from your perspective?
It is not pretty. But it's complex, Harold. There are a lot of really large forces, strong forces that are at play. First of all, we had the pandemic with COVID-19. And this is something you could never have predicted. There's nothing we could have ever really prepared for at the level we wish we had. So there's the whole issue of health, access to health, and what's, again, our obligation to our neighbors, the neighboring countries, to let them know what problems we're having, health problems we're having inside our own country.
Yeah.
Another big force is the economy. The pandemic, well, let me start again. The economy always goes in cycles. Expand, contract, expand, contract. And clearly we were ready for a contraction, have been for the last year or so. But the pandemic put booster rockets on the economy and on the contraction. Well, if you look at our current market, stock market, it looks like it's hanging in there. Well, is it, or is it artificially being held up? So what's going to happen with the economy, and where are we going to end up with the economy? Knowing that the people who are the individual contributors in organizations were making just enough money and enough income to make ends meet, and now they've been unemployed for several months, and how long will they remain unemployed? And then the other big force at play that has always been in this country is racism, but it's around the world, Harold. Racism is around the world.
Yeah.
And here's something that has changed to me that I'm hearing in the mental model around racism that I haven't heard before. There was, you are a racist or you're not a racist. And now what they're saying is to not be a racist is not enough. That's not enough because that's a neutral position. The new position is you have to be anti-racist, which has action in it.
That's right. That's right. I had a conversation on the radio yesterday. As you and I were preparing for this conversation today, you mentioned that to me last week, and it caught my attention. And then I was on Sunday Cafe here on Magic Talk in New Zealand with Roman Travers, and we got on that topic. Roman hit on the same thing, which is it's not enough to just say I'm not a racist. It makes a difference to actually take the extra step in terms of action. Being an anti-racist is a different thing from not being a racist. And it's a powerful example of then what compassionate empathy would look like.
Absolutely. So then look at the progress you and I've seen. Back in the 60s and 70s, there was equal opportunity.
Yeah.
That was how we were supposedly going to bring people together.
Yeah.
Then it moved into diversity. But remember, the whole point about diversity is that you and I would talk about our differences, and we'd highlight the differences and say, you're different than me, love you, there you go. And then we moved on to inclusion. Yes, you're different, and we need to include you and begin to understand that you and I are the community, and how do we build the community and a relationship that includes other people and brings other people in. You and I have seen a progression. Where is it going? What would an anti-racist be doing? What's the next step? And I don't think we know that yet.
It is I think it's fascinating that you and I have become very, very, very dear friends. I'm a Black guy who grew up in a predominantly Black city, Washington, D.C., coming of age in the 60s. And you are a white woman who grew up in the South. A part of the country that unfortunately has carried with it a bit of a stigma associated with racism, the southern states, if you will, in that respect there. So I find it fascinating that in 2020, here we are, you and me, connected and talking about systemic racism. Perspective is everything, isn't it? Compared to 2 weeks ago, I'm largely optimistic now.
You're optimistic because you're in New Zealand. I'm afraid I wouldn't be as optimistic as I wish I could be for what's going on in the United States. A lot has to change, Harold, structurally, as well as mental models. I mean, there's just so much that has to change here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm optimistic because the demography in the protests is a lot different than it was in 1968. We see more young people out there. We see more white people out there, particularly here in New Zealand. We had another protest yesterday, and the great majority of the crowd, white people out marching with signs, holding up signs, Black Lives Matter. And so I don't think it'll be eradicated. I don't think systemic racism will be eradicated in our lifetime, but I'm hopeful for my grandsons who are 7 and 5 that their experience and when they're in their 60s will be different.
I hope so as well. And I agree with you, it's going to take some time, but can we see the system? I'm not sure whites are able to see the systemic structural barriers, racist barriers. I'm just not sure this is going to take a while. And how do we maintain relationship, not turn it into hate or anger? How do we maintain relationship while we have those kinds of conversations? That's what you and I have always said we do for work. We help people have the conversations they need to have, but either don't know how to have or are afraid to have. And that's what you and I do for work. If you look at how you and I have always worked together.
That's right. Taking people deeper around their thinking. It wasn't until I moved to New Zealand that because I'd never been part of what's called a coalition government, where there are more than just two ways of looking at things. So growing up in America and never having lived anywhere else until coming to New Zealand, I never found it odd that there's a binary perspective on either you're a Republican or a Democrat. Every now and then an independent arises. And then I come to a small nation of 4.5 million people. And there's like 13 political parties here. And when they sit down together, they have to form a coalition, which requires the dialogue to be more civil in that respect there. Can you relate to what I'm saying? I'm wondering if the mental model that needs to shift in the U.S. might be, there's more than two ways to look at the world.
Absolutely. And it'd be interesting to see if we'll ever be able to break down that structure. That would take a lot, Harold.
It would take a lot. It would take a lot. And like I said earlier, not necessarily optimistic that it'll happen in my lifetime, but I'm hoping my grandsons will see it. Now, I'm particularly focused on your PhD, which was in consciousness and spirituality, which sounds like a timely topic. And so please tell us the essence of your PhD, which sounds very deep and enlightening. How do you weave consciousness and spirituality into your work with others, and particularly now?
So let me start off by saying it's not religion. So that's not what consciousness and spirituality is about. It's about the dimensions in which another dimension in which we exist. And how I got interested in it, Harold, was I watched some people come to work and absolutely adore their work. You know, they were just in the right place, right time, always doing what they need to do and at their best. And other people would come to work and grumble, probably from the moment they got out of bed, but grumble from the minute they walked into the door and grumbled all day long until they left. So what is it about this thing called work? Because we all have to do it. What is it about this thing called work that can be meaningful, that can be purposeful? And that's the reason I started pursuing it, was what is the spiritual dimension of the human being? How can we be conscious and not unconscious in the way in which we approach our work and other parts of our life, so that we can bring our whole self to work? And that's exactly what I did my dissertation on. Do executives bring their whole selves to work? And if they don't, what part of themselves do they leave at home? And interestingly enough, they do bring, I'll tell you what, in the interviews that I did, the three most common things that they left at home. First was their creative side and their new ideas. Well, Harold, why do we hire executives if it's not to bring new ideas and creativity? The second thing they left at home was their energy or their heart. Again, we expect them to be a role model for bringing the organization full of energy and vitality and creativity. And the third piece of themselves, element of themselves they left at home, was their soul or their spirit. And that just broke my heart, Harold. And I would say, why is that? And they would say, because it's not safe.
Yeah.
Harold, if it's not safe for an executive to bring his heart or soul to work, then you know for the rest of the organization it's not safe.
Yeah.
So that's the work I do, that I'm trying to make sure that organizations become a place where you can bring your whole self and your spirit and your heart and your creativity to work.
You are hitting on the essence of inclusion. When you and I met back in 1993, inclusion was not the word that followed diversity. It was just diversity. And you and I both have lived enough life to remember when it was called affirmative action.
Yes.
Prior to that, but you're hitting on the essence of inclusion in that sense that because most people work full time and certainly more than 40 hours a week, most people that I know, that's a lot of investment of time if you are required to be inauthentic in your contribution.
Yes. Imagine spending 2/3 of your life. That's the amount of time we spend in our life at work. We spend 2/3 of your life not there, not fully present. Interestingly, the executives that I interviewed, on Friday evening, they had a ritual for bringing their whole self back into being. Yeah. Saturday was a whole day of being themselves. And on Sunday, before the work week began, they had a ritual again to start stealing themselves and putting away, compartmentalizing that part of themselves that they found was most precious.
That is, yeah, absolutely. I can relate to that personally. Well, we both can in that sense of bringing your whole person to work. Now, Charlotte, let me shift gears a little bit because I thought about you last week. I was watching a TED Talk by Ken Blanchard, who also co-authored numerous books with others. And Kim Blanchard said in that TED Talk that in order to collaborate well with others, you have to get your pride and ego out of the way. And it was an amusing way that he told the story. You have co-authored with Peter Senge and 3 others 2 best-selling books in the business world ever. What was that like? I've written a few books, but never with multiple authors. Like, so what was that like, first of all? How did you get invited to, how did you hook up with them all?
There was the company you mentioned. The company in Boston used to be called Innovation Associates, and we were a consulting firm. And we were all working together, and we tried to say, how could we describe what we do to a larger group of people? And that's how the first book, Peter Senge's 5th Discipline, came out. And then people said, well, come do it to us, make us one. And that's when we wrote the 5th Discipline field book, How Do You Become a Learning Organization? And the Dance of Change was, how do you sustain? So what I'd say, first of all, how did we come together was because it was the consulting work that we were doing. And what was it like? It was like being a learning organization. We were all together for one clear purpose, giving what we could, listening intently, inviting other people, because if someone looks at the book, they'll see all the people, voices we invited into the book. It's not just us talking. So we were as inclusive as we could possibly be, hoping that it would make a difference in the world. Now, you could ask me, do I think that the learning organization stuck, the whole concept stuck? I'd have to say, I don't know. I'll tell you what I do see. The discipline of systems thinking, people still are looking for it, asking for it, trying to practice it even more, practice it better. Team learning, not just team building, but team learning, where everybody on the team gets smarter about the IQ, the work rather, that the team has to do. And you mentioned it earlier, mental models. That's the thing I think that we got started and is still hanging on. People do talk about mental models or paradigms and how they have to change and how dominant they are in the performance of an organization. So I don't know that we have causes the DNA to change. I'll tell you the one thing that didn't stick and how we got into the whole concept of learning organization. Getting people to tell truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth about what's going on. You know, at work, it's just not safe.
That's right.
We're all at risk to tell truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth.
Yeah.
And I see it's human nature, and I don't see that has changed very much.
The tools that you introduced us to back in 1993 at Amico, and then coming in to work with me at Prudential as well, resonate deeply over here. In terms of the left-hand column, for example, and that is being able to put things on the table that previously might have been undiscussable, and for people learning how to do that. Phenomenal impact in companies around something that is, when you lay it out there, you're basically just saying, hey, leaders, make it easier for people to talk candidly.
Absolutely. The ladder of inference. Why do you and I read the same report and come to a different conclusion? Well, I now have a way to walk up the ladder and see what it is that you see differently than I do. And that's inclusion. That's diversity and inclusion in action.
It most certainly is. I still value your, I think you introduced this to me in 1993, and that is, there is a direct correlation between the quality of conversations, the quality of thinking, and the quality of decisions. It is such a powerful model.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've worked with executive teams for a while, and that's how I got interested in boards. So boards of directors are so important to an organization. I mean, you look at the power that they have and the oversight that they have. And how I got interested in working with boards is, if this organization, the executive team has such a grand vision, how are we going to enroll the board? And how in the world is that board learning? How is that board getting better at what they're doing? How do they have, and when do they have those deep conversations? Because their agendas typically don't have room for deep conversations.
I am really glad that your focus over the last decade or so has shifted to boards, because I've become more aware in my work with executive teams how essential it is for a board to be strong and healthy. And unfortunately, there are a lot of unhealthy boards around the world. Some board meetings can sometimes feel like a boxing match.
Yes, and sometimes it can feel like it's a social club, just everybody sitting around drinking and smoking, and just whatever he says or she says, let's do it. So I think that's the reason Martha Somerville and I wrote the book, The Mindful Board. We talk about 4 different kinds of board and the progression of board development over time, so that the board becomes familiar and at ease with each other and the work they have to do. The executive team's timeline is usually about a decade. I usually think about out in at least about 10 years. The board's timeline is in perpetuity. Even though you're only going to serve on the board 8 years or 10 years, your timeline when you're thinking and the board's making decisions should be like in perpetuity. Will this help us sustain ourselves over long term? That's 2 different worlds. So how do we have that conversation? So Harold, I have people think about what's the boundary between the board and the officers, and how would you describe the characteristics of that boundary, and how do we respect the boundary while still being able to work together, learn together for the benefit of the organization?
It is, you make a great point in the sense of, and particularly in terms of if the executive team is making an effort to go deeper in their thinking, looking out more systemically and long term, the board would essentially have to do the same thing. So I am glad that you and Martha have put some focus in that realm. Now, what's your sweet spot these days in 2020? The 2 global pandemics aside, one viral and one racial. If we could just push that back a little bit, what's bringing you joy these days in terms of your work?
I still enjoy working with one executive at a time. What I typically get called in to do is to coach an executive who is not getting the opportunities she or he thinks they should have, and or not getting the feedback that he or she deserves to get. So sometimes the executive will call me and say, will you come in and be my coach? Sometimes it's the boss who says, will you come in and fix Harold?
Yeah. And
that's always a tricky way when I'm supposed to be the veterinarian who comes in and fixes somebody.
But you still thrive on that one-on-one coaching. I know exactly what you mean. And I have felt that significantly myself over the last little while, particularly virtually. I just love a person who is motivated to lift capability and lift that capability.
And their presence, just who they are and the influence they can have. That's where my work in consciousness and spirituality comes in, Harold, because I really look at that person and what is their intent, what's their deepest intent. If they could bring their whole selves to work, what would they be adding into the environment?
Yeah.
And just watching a person come into themselves fully.
Yes.
And I know that you wrote about that in the imposter syndrome.
That's right.
How do I retrieve myself when I'm scared to death with a new position? How do I retrieve myself and come back fully into the organization and the new work?
That's right. That's right. Hey, look, for people who are listening who call themselves a coach, whether it be a life coach or an executive coach, many people wear that title. And you have been a superb coach. You've been a coach to me, and you've coached some of the biggest chief executives and business leaders in the world. So just wanted to end by having you download a couple of things that you've learned about life as a coach, some perspective that you might want to share with people who do the same work.
Interesting. Well, first I'd say, care for the person you're looking at. Choose to see the goodness in them and assume good intent until they prove otherwise. And when I'm coaching, that's one of the things I do with the person I'm coaching and ask them to do with me. The other thing I'd say is if we're going to grow, if we're going to realize our potential, we've got to be open to feedback and be willing to change. And that's just not easy for human beings.
That's
so
right.
Then try on those new behaviors that go with it. And the last thing I'd say is whenever you're in a new situation, find yourself a sponsor and find yourself a mentor. They're not the same person. When I go into a new organization, my sponsor is the one who will promote me, advocate for me. My mentor is the one who will coach me and be specific on coaching. So find someone to make sure you have a sponsor, make sure you have a mentor. and just live your life, Harold.
I love it. I love it. You have been the essential example of mentor for me. And so whenever I am talking with business teams about the distinction between a leader, a manager, a coach, and a mentor, whenever I get to mentor, your name is, I put it out there all the time, Charlotte, because again, you introduced me to a philosophy around learning organizations and systems thinking that has altered my life in a significant and positive way. I want to thank you so much for joining us here today on Real People, particularly at this point in time in 2020. Charlotte, if people want to get in touch with you or learn more about you, can you give us just your website, any contact details?
Right. My website is charlotteroberts.biz, B-I-Z. That's my website. Or you can email me at charlotteroberts@charter.net.
Excellent. Excellent. And I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of Real People. I love what I do largely because I get to connect with people like Charlotte Roberts. Thanks so much, Charlotte, and thanks everyone else for joining us today.